Launch, launch, launch. Sequencer reset. Ignition. Guidance on, we are supersonic. Supersonic. Ready to set. Ready to set. Set. Separation.
Bomber, the X-15 rips through the sound barrier, climbing to new heights. Designed to explore the limits of speed and altitude, the X-15 sets a string of aviation records on its way to changing history. Tonight, fly with the aircraft that opened the door to space.
North American Corporation's X-15 test vehicle was to prove the most successful of the X-series research planes. In the Wrights, North American test pilot Scott Crossfield helped design and build the X-15 and flew the first missions. Together with NASA test pilot Joe Walker and Air Force Captain Robert White, Crossfield and his fellow flyers were subjected to rigorous physical and technical training, the equal of later astronaut indoctrination programs. Experience with simulators and centrifuge training prepared these test pilots for the difficulties that lay ahead. On the fourth mission, led to an emergency landing that buckled the X-15 fuselage. Pilot Scott Crossfield emerged unscathed, though repairs to the plane took 4 months. The arrival of a more powerful throttle-controlled rocket engine generated new excitement. The reconfigured X-15 underwent a series of routine integration checks. A faulty relief valve explosion that virtually destroyed the X-15. The blast flung the forward section away from the flames, shielded the cockpit from the intense heat. Crossfield was soon able to fly again. This flight was aborted to jettison the remaining fuel before the X-15 slammed or loaded on touchdown. The landing gear collapsed, resulting in this near-fatal crash. Undaunted by these setbacks, the X-15 crew marched ahead. Walker set a new speed record.
60 at 165. Out of back area, Joe. Roger. Windshield for course. Gyro and brake. Go. Service temp rising. Burn out. +3+. You made it.
White followed with a new mark for high-altitude flight.
Fly an aircraft. Pull up. Roger. Right on the track. Your angle looks good, Bob. Sure going up. Pass 9. Going through 11 now. Burn out. Out now. At coming 12 now. At 12.6. And 13. Very sensitive. That's still good. This is fantastic up here.
And the X-15 continued to leapfrog higher and faster, eventually exceeding Mach 6 and flying higher than 350,000 feet. The pioneering work of test pilots Crossfield, Walker, and White received public acclaim reminiscent of the early days of flight.
By this time, a new generation of test pilot had emerged. Men with dreams of going into space. Before reaching such ambitious goals, these men would need to train tirelessly in simulated cockpits. Here, NASA pilot Milt Thompson is becoming acquainted with the complex array of systems he would later validate in flight. The simulator was a relatively new training tool, which would become vital in preparing this new generation of pilots for future flights. Revolutionary pressure suits monitored the effects of weightlessness and extraordinary G-forces. However, these suits clearly provided little in the way of pilot comfort.
It was kind of like a sausage skin, and the more you blew it up, why, the more trouble you had bending your elbows and your knees, and the workload got very high then in what we called a hard or a pressurized suit.
The F-104 would trace the X-15's flight corridor, following a series of tracking stations along the mountains of Utah and Nevada. By late 1961, all three X-15s were finally together at Edwards in flying condition. NASA's request for 3 X-15s had been fulfilled, and from now on, these aircraft would take turns breaking new records in both speed and altitude. The third X-15, refurbished after an on-ground explosion, was now the most advanced of the three, equipped with a control system that could adapt to changing atmospheric density. The X-15 was refueled slowly overnight before a mission to avoid thermal shock to the airframe from the super-cold liquid oxygen propellant. Test pilot Bill Dana was aware of the volatility of the propellant used in the X-15. Their presence made sitting in the cockpit like sitting on a 17,000-pound bomb, but this didn't seem to bother Dana.
Gasoline's very explosive too, but we all drive automobiles that use it. And the same was true of the ammonia and the liquid oxygen, that under the proper circumstances they could have been explosive, but I never considered it a dangerous airplane at all. Quite the other. I was quite confident that the X-15 would get me home.
The X-15 would get Bill Dana home, but not before giving him the ride of his life. This white rectangle on the X-15's underside is frost caused by the liquid oxygen tank within the fuselage. All 9 tons of LOX and ammonia would be swallowed up by the powerful XLR-99 rocket engine in less than 2 minutes after ignition. This short period of thrust would be enough to leave the chase planes far behind in the quest to Mach 6. Despite all the simulator training, there was no substitute for the real thing.
It went from Mach 1 to Mach 6 in about 85 seconds, and it went from Mach 5 to Mach 6 in about 8 seconds. So it was, you knew you were hauling the freight when you flew the X-15.
Because of the excessive G-forces encountered, certain cockpit controls were modified because they were difficult to reach during the massive acceleration.
It was a tremendous physical effort to reach your hand out and grab the throttle to shut the engine down. That was a strong physical effort. You were just pinned back in the seat, basically, is what it was, and everything required 3 times as much effort as it would have under 1G.
Bill Dana would go on to fly 15 successful flights, including one on August 21st, 1968, for which he was awarded astronaut wings. Later missions carried out further exoatmospheric research, like the effects of micrometeorites on aircraft, as well as high-altitude photography, crucial data in paving the way for future space exploration. These thrusters would prove invaluable as pilots pushed the X-15 to the edges of space. Time had come to break through the threshold into space. Bob White was chosen to make the attempt. On July 17, 1962, Bob White pulled away from the Earth at a 41-degree climb angle towards the stars. He quickly passed Joe Walker's previous altitude record, and before he knew it, had peaked at 314,000 feet, an astronomical 59.6 miles above the Earth. When White saw the entire western seaboard clear to Mexico, he knew he was in space. The third X-15, with all of its elaborate control systems uniquely designed for high-altitude flight, had clearly proved its worth, making it the highest aircraft ever flown. Bob White was the first to take a winged aircraft into space and return it safely to Earth. This was not enough for Joe Walker, now embarking on his last mission. On August 22, 1963, Walker rocketed away from the launch plane, minutes later reaching over 354,000 feet, the highest the X-15 would ever go. Many pilots would now have the unique opportunity to experience spaceflight. Bill Dana was one of them.
The sky is absolutely black, just totally black. And then the horizon appears as a ring of bright blue just around the surface of the Earth. And it's not disorienting at all to be up at the altitudes I was at. I knew where the Earth was and what level flight was. I didn't have any trouble controlling my airplane. I was usually busy when I was up there, so I never had much time to sightsee, but I do remember one flight I went to 300,000 feet, and just over the top I took the time to look out, and I looked out and could see the Pacific Ocean to my right and the Gulf of California straight ahead of me. And that was an awesome sight.
On November 9, 1962, test pilot Jack McKay was forced to make an emergency landing after an engine malfunction. During touchdown, the left landing gear fractured. McKay survived, but sustained serious injury. Ironically, this accident would result in the construction of the fastest airplane ever. In just over a year, the X-15 number 2 transformed into the X-15A2. External fuel tanks would provide the extra fuel to give additional thrust. It was now an aircraft capable of taking its pilot to new extremes. Creating an aircraft capable of going 8 times the speed of sound almost proved easier than protecting it from the blistering heat encountered at such speeds. Heat friction was particularly destructive to the leading edges of the wing and tail surfaces. Coatings of paint were used on wind tunnel models to expose these potential hotspots. It was decided that before each mission, the aircraft would be covered with a resin-based coating that would boil off at high speeds, taking the heat with it. Air Force Captain William Pete Knight was chosen to push the X-15 to its absolute speed limit. Knight had been slated for spaceflight in the X-20, but after program cancellation, he joined the X-15 program, replacing Major Robert Rushworth. The A2 had another unique feature. Because the ablative coating chars off at extreme speeds, the left windshield would need to remain covered to protect it from being coated with the residue. When the worst was over, the eyelid was opened, and the pilot would have a clear windshield to look through as he made his final approach and landing. After several familiarization flights, Pete Knight was ready to take the A2 to new extremes. The A2 was also equipped with a mock-up scramjet mounted on the ventral fin stub. NASA was interested in testing scramjet propulsion systems which depend on hypersonic velocities to achieve combustion.
Launch.
After the drop, Knight ignited the powerful XLR-99 engine and pointed the nose upwards. With the external fuel tanks and ablative coating, the X-15 was finally an aircraft that could keep up with its huge engine. In just over a minute, the external tanks were jettisoned as the aircraft pushed to its maximum speed. Prior to landing, the dummy scramjet needed to be jettisoned as well. Pete Knight had reached the blistering speed of Mach 6.7, over 4,500 miles per hour, making the X-15 the fastest winged aircraft ever. The A-2 had finally validated the intentions of its original designers. Pete Knight was now the fastest man alive, but the aircraft had paid the price. The heat stresses were far worse than predicted. Even with the protective coating, the airframe was severely damaged. The scramjet mount had burned through and fallen away.
On the flight to Mach 6.7, why the wake of the dummy ramjet, the Mach waves coming off the dummy ramjet impinged on the ventral fin and cut holes in both sides of it and did damage to substructures and the subsystems inside the ventral fin.
Pete Knight had been unaware of the devastating extent of the aircraft's damage. The ablative coating on the leading edges had charred through, causing serious structural problems. Furthermore, Mach 6.7 was not even close to the speed that NASA needed to carry out research on the scramjet system. And there was no money in the budget to repair and modify the crippled aircraft. The A-2 was the first X-15 retired from the program. Just over a month later, on November 15, 1967, X-15 number 3 would be completely lost. This tragic mission began without a problem. Air Force pilot Michael Adams took the aircraft over Mach 5. Then something went terribly wrong. Adams had somehow gotten off course, and on re-entry found himself in a spin. At 5 times the speed of sound, this was too much for the airframe, which disintegrated. Michael Adams did not survive. This cockpit footage provides an eerie reminder of the dangers of experimental flight. The only X-15 left was X-15 number 1, the first of the 3 to be built. This aircraft would fly 8 more missions, but never again to the extremes of speed and altitude that were accomplished by its 2 counterparts. The X-15's final missions further examined the obstacles of spaceflight. However, by the late 60s, landing man on the moon became a national priority, and interest in the X-15 program began to wane. When Bill Dana touched down on October 24, 1968, completing the 199th mission, no one realized that this was the last X-15 flight. It was intended the program would finish by year's end with the 200th flight. 10 unsuccessful launch attempts later, the program was canceled. Relics of history, the 2 surviving X-15s now sit silently as museum pieces. Much of their data remaining on the shelf, while man tried to reach the moon. There remains speculation as to whether advancements like the space shuttle would have come earlier had we taken up the X-15's legacy sooner. The X-15's first pilot, Scott Crossfield.
We've milked that database dry. It's, you know, we've used it all, and we're really out of it now. But no, the X-15, as far as useful information for the progress of aeronautics in space, is one of the most productive programs we ever had.
The X-15 bequeathed a truly great legacy, taking men to the extremes and beyond.